in Afghanistan, a political economy perspective from 2001 to 2021. I'm very honored, CGM and I are very honored to have my esteemed scholar and colleague, Sarajuddin Isar, who have been working on this issue as a part of his doctoral dissertation that I hope one day we will have it as a book for all the readers. So to give you a short perspective before I hand over the floor to Sarajuddin Isar to deliver his speech, this talk will be focused on fiscal dimension of state building in Afghanistan. He will try to examine the relationship between state building and taxation with a particular focus on the two recent Republican administration of Afghanistan, respectively President Karzai and President Ghani's. While also he will try to place his analysis within a longer term historical framework. The aim is to answer to three main questions. He will try to answer that. How have state taxation policies evolved and changed over time? Second, what explains these changes in taxation policies? And finally, what are the theoretical and policy implications of these findings? So as far as I understand, and I have heard you speaking on the same topic elsewhere, you have been using settlement theory of Mushtaq Khan and trying to explain the dynamics between state building and taxation fiscal policies. But I will also be interested to have you speak on, probably in the last few minutes of your presentation, on how these dynamics evolve under recent 1.5 years or 2 years of Taliban rule in Afghanistan. But before I hand over the floor, let me also briefly introduce Sarajuddin Isar. He is a political economy researcher with extensive experience in taxation and state building, banking, and financial management. He has recently completed a PhD on political economy of taxation and state building in Afghanistan at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SWAS. But currently, he is affiliated as a postdoctoral fellow at CICAM Roadbound University. Pardon me or correct me if I pronounced the university's name incorrectly. Anyway, but thank you so much for your time and willingness to join us today and speak about your research. Looking forward to it. It's now turning over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sadr and the CGM team for giving me this honor and pleasure to talk to you guys and the audience about my research on taxation and state building in Afghanistan, like what you rightly introduced from a political economy perspective. So the research is very much focused, like what you said, Dr. Sadr, on post-Afghanistan, but I also discuss some of the historical perspective. So what I'm going to be talking in this presentation, do you know how long I have for this presentation? Is it about how long?
Yeah, you can speak around 15 to 15 minutes will be roughly 15 minutes will be good. And then I will invite participants who are joining us online to also drop their questions if they have in the chat box, or later on I can have them speak directly.
Okay, cool. So based on that, then I'll try to make it meet the timeline. Okay, so I will briefly go through the research question, although you have read it. So I'll then go on my analytical framework, the research findings, both historical and as well as post-Afghanistan. So the overarching research question is very much focused on discovering the relationship or unraveling the relationship between taxation policies and practices and state building in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021. But of course, if time allows, I'll address your questions about its implication in the current time of the de facto administration of the Taliban. So the three questions, or I just repeat them quickly. It asks about how have state taxation policies evolved and changed over time. This is the how type of questions. And then what explains these changes in taxation policy? And I will then move on to the theoretical and policy implication of these findings. So my analytical framework, I borrow some of the classic endogenous model of state building theory. I just introduced them because of the historical background. So that is very much based on Western European model. You guys may know about Tilly, about the capital, coercion, and legitimacy. So the three themes that he introduces is all about how war makes a state, state makes war. And then that theme, under that theme, he means how rulers neutralize external and domestic rival threats. And for that, he asks the people, the ruler kind of offer protection for the people against those threats, both of the threat, external and the domestic. And that kind of mechanism led to creation of armies in the context of Western European countries. And then the third and final theme is the extraction. So protection has got a cost, and that cost comes from taxation. And that is how tax administration in the context of European Union kind of has emerged or has been established. And we can see how it is working in current day. So my key analysis in this thesis is basically challenging the good governance agenda, the liberal, which is the very current exogenous model of state building, and its implication or application in the context of taxation, and very much in the context of a very conflict setting like Afghanistan. So you guys very well know, and I'm sure Dr. Sadr, you have always been discussing about the topic of liberalism. So you all know that it's all about holding democracy, bringing democracy, holding election, establishing rule of law, building liberal institutions, the governance, the structure, the processes. And mainly when you talk about the taxation, building the tax administration, the tax system, that is very much weak in most of the developing countries. So I argue that that model in the context of conflict setting like Afghanistan does not work. And the reason for that is because that model, A, is a very universalized template. It focuses on building the state formal institution, formal structures, and formal processes. It is very much a reflection of donors' prescriptions, so much to do with IMF and World Bank, create an administrative capacity to govern based on existing best global practice, but not taking into account the reality on the ground in most of these developing world. So it misses an important dimension, that is the complex role of power configuration, where I discussed this under the political settlement. So it misses how formal institution can get shaped by the underlying nature of political settlement, power configuration, and obviously the informal processes, informal networks, and informal coalitions. So what is political economy model? On political economy model, I very much borrow the political settlement framework from Mushtaq Khan. He argues that political settlement, according to Khan, is about how power and resources are distributed and organized, but more importantly, about the institutional arrangement that kind of sustains this. Rent and rent sharing is very much the core of the political settlement. If there is no rent sharing, there is no political settlement. Political settlements are not static. They are dynamic, fluid, and they are subject to adoption, renegotiation, and contestation. They are not a one-time event. They are rather evolving agreement between powerful actors. They are not conflict resolution, which many people confuse this, nor are they a peace agreement or a political or an elite pact. They are understood as an interactive order, the product of eminent processes in which elites basically react to changes that is going on around them. And then the second framework that I also borrow is very much similar to the political settlement framework, is the limited access order that I borrow from Douglas North and et al.'s theory. So core in that argument is about creation of rents by limiting access to valuable resources and functions so that only certain elite groups can access them. So when elites are allowed or can access rents, then they will avoid violence and they will get co-opted, and that's how stability and order can can be sustained in most of the developing countries. And of course, the type of limited access order is different. You've got fragile, you have basic, you've got mature. And I'm not going to be discussing those given the limited amount of time I have. So the research, if I jump into the research finding, my research finding is that the interaction, this is both in the context of a current, both in post-war Afghanistan, as well as the historical empirical evidence, the interaction between three intertwined and complex factors kind of shapes up taxation and state building nexus in Afghanistan, both historically and of course even today. So they are namely the nature of political settlement, which I just explained, and the taxation policies and practices, but more importantly, the last but not least, the international influence via aid and assistance. So if I just quickly jump into the history to provide with some historical background. So the early Durrani rulers, Afghanistan was a kind of confederation of tribes and khanis, and the kind of political settlement that sustained there based on distribution of rent, it was very loose and it was very shaky, and taxation was very much eased. So war making and conquest of Indian subcontinents was a source of revenue and a source of rents generated for these powerful political elites. And that's like what I explained. So rent was key to accessing in those territories. So when in early 19th century, when the Indian territories get lost, so those distribution of those rents also either cut off or disappear. So loss of rents led one of the Durrani ruler like Dost Muhammad Khan to push towards more taxing the Khans who kind of enjoyed exemption at a time. This is also the moment when the British intervention through British subsidy also come into play, because Dost Muhammad Khan and other British as successors were not able to generate enough revenue, so that's why they depended on aid, and that's why I call Afghanistan an aid-rentier country or economy, at least for the past 2 centuries. So British intervention in Afghanistan emerges. British intervention in Afghanistan leads to emergence of Afghanistan as a buffer state, and that's when Abdur Rahman Khan, when he comes into power, he disrupts the kind of political settlement that was forged by his predecessors. He overly centralizes power and he disrupts the kind of rent distribution that was there. He imposes taxation on landowners who were enjoying the exemption before. He used religion to justify his centralization policies, both at the power level as well as at the taxation level. And he says that God has commanded every subject to pay taxes to the king, and if anyone neglects or avoids to pay taxes or subject to punishment. And that's why he imposed direct and coercive taxation, so much similar to what we see at the moment by the Taliban. So nobody likes to pay taxes, and that's why taxation and centralized and exclusive policies, excuse me, it leads to rebellion. But at the same time, Abdur Rahman Khan was in receipt of subsidies from Britain, and this allows him or enables him to kind of suppress the rebellion. But when Amanullah Khan comes in power in 1919 to 1929, so Afghanistan become independent, and the independence cost Afghanistan the loss of the British subsidy. So when Amanullah Khan is not in receipt of subsidies that his predecessor was in receipt of, so he pushes towards more taxing the people. And if you look at the figures, Afghanistan budget in the whole of history has the surplus during the 10 years of Amanullah Khan's rule, there only. And he also centralizes power, and of course, so many other reforms at the social level, along with the taxation policy, then they get resisted. And since he was not in receipt of the kind of aid or British subsidy that Abdur Rahman Khan was in receipt of, so he could not fund or sustain the army. That's why he was not able to suppress the revolt. As a result of this, his government collapses. And when Mosahiban comes in power in 1933 to 1978, so they learned the lesson from Aman law, and that's why they pursue a very conservative type of political settlement. And that settlement is forged between the regime and the landed elites and the clergy. To make the political settlement is working, what the Mosahiban kings do, basically, they avoid taxing the people, they kind of favor tax holidays. And this, as a result of this, what happens basically, an order gets sustained, which I call them the limited access order of Douglas North. And that's why people in Afghanistan often call those days beautiful days of peace, because there was no violence. However, the institutions gets very much weakened, and particularly the tax administration or the fiscal basis of the system. And if you look at the figures, the GDP, the share of taxes to the GDP never moves beyond the 7%. So, and during the Civil War era, so when the Democratic Party of Afghanistan comes in power from 1978 to 1991, so in early days, it was a very fractured type of political settlement, very divided between Khalqis and Pachamis. And this was divided basically along the ethnic and linguistic line. The Khalqi rulers were very much pursued very radical transformation, and they pursued brutal policies, and they refused any coalition building with existing political elite, and they declared war against the clergy. So like Abdurrahman Khan, Khalqis used aid-assisted coercion to neutralize whoever was against them. But what Parchami did, Babrak Karmal and then Dr. Najibullah, the two rulers, they followed a policy of encapsulation. Of course, there are differences between the two types of the policies, between Babrak Karmal and between Dr. Najibullah, but it was very much based on a cooption policy at the periphery level. So they were both in receipt of the Soviet aid. So just like Mosahiban, they made alliances to traditional elites, clergy, tribes, and powerful elites, and rent distribution to powerful elite kind of maintained a limited access order or an order, but it was very much fragile given the insurgency was going on in the country. But as a result of this policy, encapsulation or cooption policy, again, our taxation system could not develop during the PDPA's rule. Of course, during the Mujahideen government, the state collapses basically, and it was a kind of fragmented, shaky political settlement. 4 to 5 ruling powerful factions controls trade routes, and so custom revenue again became a source of rents for those, and aid was totally cut off, and it was a kind of fragmented, impaired. It was a fragmented political settlement, like what I said. So when Taliban comes in power, so you see that Abdurrahman Khan is back. So their policy was so much exclusive, and their taxation policy was also very coercive. They created a very centralized system, and majority of their power holders were basically the mullahs and the Pashtuns. And they had the Kandahar Shura with 2 sub-shuras, Kabul Shura and the military Shura. Kabul Shura was like a cabinet. So despite the cabinet, Kandahar Shura was overruling. So, but they were also in receipt of aid money. Of course, there are no figures how much exactly, but Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, 2 of the 2 countries who recognized them as legitimate government, provided aid and assistance to them. UAE, I don't think has supported them, even though UAE also recognized their government. So institution building again came at the very was no longer at the core of attention of the Taliban. So it was very much an informal sort of institutions, very much informal off-budget tax system. And interestingly, Mullah Omar, who was the ruler of the Taliban at the time, had a trunk full of cash, and that was his fiscal purse, basically, that he would use and that was under his bed, and he used it to pay for his troops and insurgent groups. So this is very much the historical. How long do I have, Dr. Saib? I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry. I think you covered 15 minutes, but since you have not touched upon the current scenario or your case study, so let's say another 5 to 7 minutes will be okay for you?
Yeah. I'll try to. I'll try to be quick. Okay, so post-born Afghanistan. So I divided this into Karzai first and second term, and then I will jump into Ghani's. So Karzai's in early days of Karzai, particularly between 2002 and 2004, there was a lot of optimism and hopes for state building, institution building, and even nation building, basically. And there was a strategy of institutionalization, part of which was basically building tax administration, including the centralization of revenue. And there were, of course, many reforms made on the legislation. The income tax law was revised, the VAT tax law was enacted, and on the organizational front, large taxpayer offices, medium taxpayer offices, and small taxpayer were all established across the country. And interestingly, we automated the system both at the taxes department, which I call an ARD, Afghanistan Revenue Department, and also at the custom level. So sectors, which is standard integrated government tax administration, was operation, and then a SECODA automated system for customs data was also in operation in 2007. So Finance Minister Ghani pushed towards the policy of revenue centralization and taxing more, and powerful elites at the very beginning agreed, particularly the provincial governors and local commanders, that they would transfer revenue to the central government. However, there was this time was very much, there was a lot of elite contestation between technocrats, mainly the Pashtun West technocrats led by Karzai, and the Mujahideen, mainly the Northern Alliance. So this contestation was very much shaped up by the international support, which shifted decisively to Karzai's favor and his predominant technocratic allies. So technocrat-led ministries such as Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Rural and Rehabilitation Development were favored more in receipt of fund than other ministries. So this kind of created the division from those days. And then as a result of these policies, revenue increased in early days, particularly between 2002 and 2009. But after 2009, things have changed. Things change because the insurgency is rising. Technocrats get sidelined, and the power balance moves away from the technocrats and royalists back to jihadis, and there was basically a shift in the kind of power balance and political settlement, and this had implication, of course, for the revenue. So when the 2009 election happened, so I don't want to talk about the election. I covered this under the thesis. I covered 3 elections, basically. So after 2009, the policy of Karzai was very much deinstitutionalization. So he did not bother about building the institution, particularly the tax administration. And there was, obviously, he lost his confidence on the international actors, and the relationship between Karzai and the US kind of become very much tense, and this complicates the relationship. So Karzai starts to rely more on informal institution, informal networks, and informal process than his own former ones. So he establishes a patrimonial state based on redistribution and co-option of powerful elite, just like Musahiban and King Zahir Shah. So a personally driven order is created, and institutions become divided or get divided among different functions and figures. So Karzai Cooption Policy, of course, sustained a kind of order that was there during the Zahir Shah. However, it weakens the institution building and state building efforts. So like Musahiban, he did not, or perhaps he could not bother about tax bargaining. So tax holidays were kind of favored to powerful elites. And if you look at the figures, tax revenue during his contrary to a lot of arguments, so tax revenue in his second term gets reduced. So as I said, a relative sustainability, a relative order is sustained, but this kind of policy, to not forget, was very much attributed to his leadership style. So in the literature, I argue that the political leadership style also impacts the kind of political settlement. So he came from a very tribal, traditional background. So this policy was, of course, influenced by the huge flow of aid in the country. When he was in receipt of aid, why would he care about taxing the people? But when Ghani comes into power, so first of all, it was very much of a externally imposed, but yet competing and divided political settlement. Ghani, according, just like his background, he came from, contrary to Karzai, he came from a technocratic background. That's why his focus is more on building taxation system. So what he does, basically, he introduces several tax measures and he increases tax rates as well as the tariffs at the custom level. I don't want to go into what he did on this, but I'm sure some of you may know about the 10% tax fees that he introduced on mobile phone, and everybody was so much unhappy about it. And Ghani also, like Abdurrahman Khan, over-centralizes the power, and he disrupts the kind of settlement that was forged by his predecessor, Karzai. He manages, of course, the tax revenue as a result of this tax revenue increase. So that's why, if you look at the figures, the 7 years that he was in power, particularly the first 6 years, the share of the tax to GNP reaches to 13%, over 13%. Of course, 13% is not a good rate compared to many of the developing countries, or they say if it's below 15%, your fragility will be affected. But at least at the historical level, that kind of level or that kind of ratio was unprecedented. So just to finish off the last point, so despite the differences of the policies, both at the political settlement, taxation, and the flow of aid, so there were some differences. There were some continuities, important continuities or similarities between Karzai and Ghani. So both Karzai and Ghani failed to establish a functioning taxation system. So tax base during both administrations remained very, very, very narrow. They were both unable to prevent rent seeking and rent negotiation. So tax evasion, tax leakages persisted across both administrations. At the ACD, at the Customs Department, there were a misclassification or reclassification of imported goods. What I mean here, like when goods were coming to the country, so say, for instance, luxurious goods would be classified under food item. So the importer would pay less taxes to the customs official, but this will kind of led him to enjoy cheap imported goods, but what it led was the loss of the revenue for the government. And this was also true in the ARD, Afghanistan Revenue Department. So guys, just to be clear, that ACD, customs and taxes is so different topics, and I will talk about that maybe later. So within the tax or ARD department, there was also pre-arrangement between taxpayers and tax officials. And then when a tax official will go to a wedding hall, he will just he will calculate the taxation based on an agreement, or what I call them juramat, or an arrangement. So that kind of practice led the government to lose a lot of revenue. Khalid Painda, who was the Minister of Finance during the Republic in last days, he said that they lost like $8 million a day because of the leakages of the wastage. So taxation system was exploited by custom officials, by the MPs, by the government, particularly the periphery, by whoever was in power. But the other dimension that I should also mention was the international role of budget aid flow. So off-budget aid, first of all, strengthened all the patronage system that was there. When you are in receipt of aid, accountability will go away. Donors were more accountable to their own government as opposed to the people of Afghanistan. So as a result of this off-budget aid flow, a dual public sector was created, and one was managed by the donors and other was managed by the government. So this was preventing creation or establishment of a fairly functioning taxation system. Also, this also had supported creation of an illegal and informal taxation because if you are aware of the PRTs at the periphery and the kind of contract that were enjoyed by powerful elites, so this created an illegal taxation and formal taxation at the periphery, and particularly with the growth of insurgency and the Taliban, they had their own taxation system. And one of the reasons for the collapse of the republic was the fact that Taliban were able to generate revenue at whatever area that they were in control of. And just to finish off, when the US departure plans come into play, and then the Doha peace talks, so Ghani gets sidelined, and this gave more room and way to strengthening the Taliban and their eventual takeover of the country. But more importantly, Ghani's disruptive political settlement, and of course his coercive taxation policy, weakened the power brokers who could potentially stand by his side and fight against the Taliban. And that is pretty much of it, and thank you so much. If you've got any question.
Thank you so much for that. So I encourage the audience to, if they have a question, they can drop it in the Q&A box. Otherwise, they can raise their hand. Yes. So before me jumping to your question, to ask you questions, here is Nemat Zafari. Yeah, you can unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sadr, and congratulations, Dr. Siraj, for completing your successful PhD. And it was such an informative presentation. I had a question which you touched upon at the last part about the corruption, especially mentioning about Dr. Painda. And rightly, if you count out that money, so annually it's turning out to be between $3 billion. The amount of the money that we're asking in the aid for Afghanistan. My point is about the taxation. Of course, taxation comes from the economical growth. But if you see from last 1 century or two, the country, the highest amount of budget expenditure was in security. That means Afghanistan was always in a war. So if a country is in a war, how would they look into economical growth or taxation? And which is still the same situation. It has not changed. So what's your suggestion if the country is in a war parallel, how they can economically grow or look into the economical options as well? Thank you.
Well, I think, yeah. Shall we take more questions, Dr. Sadr, or we should answer one at a time?
One at a time would be okay, I think. You can answer this, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think this is a very important question. And as I said, first of all, there is not enough literature that discusses political settlement theory in regards to studying taxation in the context of a conflict setting. But like what you said, well, if you look at the empirical historical evidence in Afghanistan, taxation, so taxation did not improve even though there was no war during the Musahiban. And if you compare this along the history, taxation itself is a factor for fueling the war. But in the context of European countries, it was different, because the kind of the war that we have now, with the kind of the war that you see in the context of the Western European countries, is very different. But investment, economic growth, these are all kind of related to war. But I agree, if you argue this for Ghani, despite the war was going on, because of his efforts toward taxing the people, so the tax revenue, the tax revenue as part of the GDP grew during his time. But if you look at the literature, empirical literature, during Karzai, even though at the early days there wasn't a lot of conflict, it was mainly after 2006, but there were no efforts basically from Karzai's administration towards pushing taxation. And also, Mr. Zafari, tax and war, they are very much interconnected. If I put it in a plain word, so economic development and economic improvement kind of help war to get reduced. Many people in Afghanistan joined the Taliban not because they because of the ideology, because they were poor. So this is what I see the story in Afghanistan.
Thank you. So I would like to push you on two things. First of all, the binary that we usually employ to explain case of Afghanistan is warlords versus technocrats. My question is, how do you conceptualize these two when it comes to your case? I have, for example, in recent literature which is produced, I plainly came across cases, for example, if I, for example, give you a concrete example, in one hand, Marshal Fahim's son is considered, for example, a warlord, but on the other hand, the chief of staff of President Ghani recently, Mateen Beg, which was also a son of warlord, he is considered technocrat. So, and I can give you many other examples. Or Mohib and Fazli, who didn't have any technocratic background at all. They were not bureaucrats. They just came out of, from market background, or they were just young people who are either entrepreneurs or from an NGO sectors. They joined the state. So, I mean, people are superficially or sometimes reluctant, in a very non-nuanced manner, you employ these two terms. If you can explain that one. Second is, how did you differentiate between the political settlement dimension of state building, wherein different actors who are involved in war, for instance, but also they are deeply embedded in society with a strong grassroots networks, they negotiate with each other. But on the other hand, you have the technical dimension of taxation. For example, you talked about leakages in the system. Mm-hmm. So in both different patterns of settlement that we had, the Karzai pattern and the Ghani pattern, how these two different patterns impacted bureaucratic or technocratic reforms? Were the reforms also following different patterns, except the fact that one was centralizing, the other was decentralizing? And can we also, do we have other, ways to explain, for example, Ghani employed much more technocratic model to regulate, for example, or develop the administrative and regulatory dimensions of the state in order to empower its capacity to fix those loopholes?
Well, if I just come from your second question, if I start with that one, basically, the historical literature that I have come from, both the empirical literature, so whatever, or any rulers who have kind of centralized power. So when I talk about centralization of power, I'm not talking about a constitutionally backed sort of centralization, because people nowadays talk a lot about federalism, decentralization model, these sort of things. You can have a centralized government, but yet can deliver power or delegate power to others. And this is what exactly happened during the different time in the history. For instance, Zahir Shah, for instance, Najibullah, to some extent, Babrak Karmal, and Karzai. If you look at their policies, they constitutionally had a centralized government, but in practice, they kind of delegated power to different segments of the society. So and when you compare, basically, and this also brings me to the question, your first question about the warlords and bureaucrats. So in the literature about the political settlement or the political economy model, so they are referred as elites. So elites in our term, we translate it as nokhbagon, which is not correct. So elites in the context of political settlement refers to anyone who has the potential to violation, who has the potential to affect or influence stability. It doesn't matter. It could be It could be a mullah imam, a malik. It could be a provincial governor. It could be a police chief. Anyone who has got the kind of potential to stability, and that's the potential to risk stability. And that was the kind of, if you look at the good book by DePauli, she is very much introducing these how bureaucrats how warlords became bureaucrats, and how this was kind of sustaining relative order and relative peace. And I think this is what Douglas North is also arguing, that in the context of the developing countries, access to resources and access to power is not open. So you don't have very well-established functioning democracy so that everybody can have, you can have your say by your votes, you can have your say by taxing. And that kind of context in developing countries, you have got to limit access to certain people or elites so that they do not get a tendency towards fighting. And I think that was exactly true with regards to the Northern Alliance, and they got socialized, and they were part of the peace process. And if you look at the literature, and that was the reason that we had relative peace in those days.
Thank you. The next question is from Samiullah. If you can.
Thank you.
Yep.
So yes, thank you, Sadacha, for letting me in. And it's a great news that you have done so an important research. My question is pretty broad. It includes basically your take on the relationship between corruption, vested interests, the prevalence of violence against the government, the lack of political will, the infusion of aid, the social contract or citizen contract, and poor services. What do you think? How do you rank in order of significance and their impact on the failure of the tax system to basically enable the government to collect, be self-reliant, and basically successfully implement its tax policies. The failure of the policies, how do you link them to all these 6 areas that I just mentioned? Corruption. Was it the violence, because the government was always on defense? Was it that the political interest was undermined, or the political will was undermined by the existence of vested interests, or the existence of violence, or because the government's survival didn't depend on tax, because we had aid coming in? Is that the reason the aid policies failed? Or was it because there was corruption? Or was it because the people didn't believe the government and didn't pay because the government was not able to provide quality services? So this catch-22, or say this complex relationship that I've been trying to get my head around, because this is a question that I've been having, and I just want to have your take on that. Thank you.
Just in a nutshell, all of them were basically the factors that kind of contributed to the failure of the republic. Yes, corruption was one of the very key impediment for state building in Afghanistan, and it was one of the very key impediment for building the fiscal basis of the government. So imagine every day the government was losing 8 million a day. So how could you build a taxation system when you cannot handle the leakages and the wastage of the resources? But corruption was kind of impacted by the fact that there was an ongoing insurgency that would lead the government cost to increase as well. So violence, yes, this was different. So when you talk about violence, so different level of violence was there, or different potential for violence was there. So you had the Taliban basically who was one of the key factors for the government failure, because A, they had their own taxation system. As much as there is a lot about they say the political economy of the borderland, the political economy of the periphery. So whoever is in rule of the power, whoever is in power of ruling any particular territory, so they will enjoy accessing the resources that were there. This was true in early Duranis, and this was also true. Look at Gulaha Sherzai, look at Atam Muhammadinu, look at Dostum, and all of them, they were kind of impediment towards the building of state or building the taxation system. But of course, later on, things have changed. Obviously, they were weakened by the government. Particularly, and my argument is that Ghani, and you also raised about the political, well, I call this as exclusionary policy. So Ghani pursued very much exclusive policy in the kind of political settlement he had. He relied on the youths, which was a good policy, but even selection of youths to run the government had problems. A, they were selective. B, they didn't have very strong social basis or political basis with their own constituency. So, for instance, very young people came to, if you look at the Ministry of Interior Affairs, or if you look at the Security Department, how could a 24-year-old lady can come and lead a very complicated war in Afghanistan? So that policy, I call them the Tommy boys or the Tommy girls, the Tommy what is that brand name? Hefegler or Helfeger. So basically they were the Yasser, the Yasser or Charkhagir, I call them in Dari. So who had no clue. And that's why this was contributing to the failure. And also Ghani did not, he weakened the power brokers, the elites. I don't call them warlords or things as such, because when you talk about this literature, so it is different. And I also stated that if he had an ally with the political elites, so he could have sustained peace and stability. And then finally, the international dimension was very also important. You got Trump, his policies, the withdrawal, all of them contributed to this. So, and then Joe Biden under the Doha Agreement, all sidelined, and also Ghani also did not want to say goodbye to his power, and he was very much to staying in power, and that's why the 2019 election was very much like that. So all of these, one after the other, kind of contributed to the failure of the republic or state building efforts in Afghanistan.
Thank you. And if I can ask you the last question, which I highlighted at the beginning of the session, comparing your case studies with the current moment, the Taliban. Some of the facts and figures, if you look at in 2019, the previous government, the Republic revenue generation from taxation was around, I mean, it constituted 21% of its revenue, around $81 billion. But when it comes to Taliban, Emirate Islami in 2022, taxation now is around roughly this 20% of the revenue, but it has decreased to 37 billion. But on the other hand, they have increased the custom revenue, which is now roughly around $100 billion, over 50% of the revenue, which is quite high compared to the Republic. So how do you think your theoretical framework of political settlement could explain the current juncture? Well, you don't have so many power brokers in Afghanistan, and the Taliban of course, they are not monolith group, but with a firm hand, to a large extent, they have extensified that centralization of fiscal management. And if there is no increase in taxation revenue, but overall the government revenue has increased because of multiple other factors. So, but my question would be, particularly with respect to taxation, and how do you use your theoretical framework to explain the current dynamics?
Well, Taliban are a de facto administration, and they are the elites. So they are basically part of the elites, and they are the kind of political settlement that they are pursuing now is the same as they had been pursuing or have been pursuing during the Taliban one. So their policy, because inclusivity and exclusivity with rents, with rent distribution, these are the very three key elements of political settlement framework. And then you need an institutional arrangement so that this can be sustained. The moment rent distribution stops, violence will pursue. Violence will follow, and this was, and I think the Taliban is just taxing the people. Just to correct some figures on the Taliban. So Taliban, there have been a lot of taboo in the past couple of years or so that the Taliban have managed to generate a lot of revenue. So the revenue they have yet generated, this is still not more than what was generated by the Republic. So they have so far generated, according to their own official figures. So this is still a subject to controversy, because when an economy is shrinking by 30 to 40%, how would one be able to generate that much of revenue? And the size of the government, of course, has also shrunk massively for the Taliban. So they, according to their own annual report, and also Kate Clark, just like a few days ago, published a paper on where the Taliban money is being spent. So if you look at those figures, Taliban generate or have been generating around 1.8 billion. So after of this, 54% of that is generated by, is constituted by the customs revenue, and the 20% of that is generated by tax, and the remaining 26 or 25+% is generated or constituted by NTR, which is non-tax revenue. And now if you look at the literature about, and I think this was part of the question that our colleague just asked about the social contract. The Taliban just know, and I think even not the Taliban, the Republic, including Ghani himself, who was the finance minister, and of course Karzai to a larger extent, they did not bother about creating or working towards establishing a fiscal social contract that we see now in most of the developed world. So what fiscal social contract is, there is a good paper by McMoore who discusses between contract and coercion. So tax has got to turn into a contract, just like how it is happening in the history of the Western European countries. So when you pay a tax, you have to feel that you get reciprocated by receiving services, be it at the education, health, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But both Republic and the Taliban in particular have failed this, and particularly the Taliban, and that's what McMoore calls it. If you cannot establish that kind of contract, so taxation turns into a coercion. And what we see at the moment in Afghanistan, with the very poor economy, with the very poor people there, it is just extortion. Taking the money by force is just a coercive measures the Taliban have been pursuing, where the services and delivery of good governance is all absent there.
So we are left with 3 minutes, and then we have a last question in the Q&A box from Sohrab Bakhshi. The question is, I just read from the text which is written, has the taxation concept in Afghanistan from Durranis to Ghani treated biased? And if the economic model of Afghanistan affected by wealth discrimination? If you need an explanation, probably, yeah, we can ask the Bakhshi Sahib to rephrase the question. But I think the question is, to what extent wealth inequality and discrimination shaped taxation policies of the state?
So Mr. Bakhshi Sahib is saying it well. I call them, and also in the political economy literature, that is called rents. So what is rent in the political economy literature? This is called, economists call it unearned revenue. We in economics, there are 3-4 factors of production. So when you produce something, you've got to invest, you've got to kind of have the capital, You have to have the land, you have to have the labor, and you have to have the kind of management. So labor, capital, and land, they are the very core of those sort of things. So if those are not embedded in that production process, so that whatever revenue that you generate is unearned. So that is called rent. So there are two types of rents, basically. The aid money that was coming, because there is no factors of production involved, and obviously the natural resources that we have, but we never use the natural resources. So just to Bakshi Soeb's question, so yes, there was when access to resources or the distribution of rents is not sort of just based on the perception of not the people, the political elites. So the instability and insurgency or the violence is highly likely, and we have seen examples in the history, the rebellion, and the history that happened. This was all because of you either tax them a lot or you cut off the sources of the rent. So the source of rent is all not just the wealth. You can power position in the government could be a source of rent. If you look at the literature about Afghanistan, Ministry of Finance, each customs department was a big source of rent accumulation, or what you call them wealth accumulation, and the people would pay a huge amount of money and being supported politically by MPs and others, so that they could be appointed in those posts. I can talk a lot about it if time allows, but I think that should answer the question.
Thank you so much. We came to the end of the session. It's almost 2 o'clock here in North America, but just want to take this last opportunity to thank you for your time to present your research and engage with others throughout this last 1.5 hours. Looking forward to reading your upcoming book or article on this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asad. It was my pleasure.
And also thanks to all our audience who participated in this session and those who will be watching us later through your YouTube channel. Have a nice day.
Thank you.